Welcome to week 2, module 5, qualified disclaimers. I would suspect that the things we've talked about in this class, for those of you who are practicing financial planners, this is probably the one thing you probably aren't aware of. I think for the most part, most financial planners are aware of what we've been discussing, and it's really most beneficial for those of you who haven't any experience as a financial planner. The qualified disclaimers are not used that often. That's probably why we don't see a lot of it. And we have an example of this individual in the cartoon kicking away some asset, and that's exactly what a disclaimer does. It doesn't accept the asset, for reasons we'll talk about as we go through this module. What is a disclaimer? A disclaimer is a formal refusal of a bequest of property from a decedent. I might note it could also be used for trust again, it would be a refusal of a benefit from a trust. And why it's important is if you take an asset and then say, I really don't want it, and you give it away to someone else, it becomes a gift. So you wind up with two taxable events at one time. It is very procedural, and failure to meet the regulations is a rejection of the bequest would make it a gift from the beneficiary. So we want to be very careful how we do it. There's really two sets of rules you should keep in mind. One is for everybody other than a spouse, and then the other rule is for the purpose of a spouse of a decedent. What do we require? First of all, the estate must be irrevocably in writing. It must be delivered to the grantor or agent within 9 months. And the agent, for example, would be the executor or a personal representative of the deceased, or if it's a trust, to the trustee, and ensures the disclaimer cannot receive any benefit from the property disclaimed nor have any control over it. And that's the key. When we say you can't receive any benefit or control, that's why you do not want to accept it. Because if you accept it, that means you are not able to disclaim it. Definition of property in a disclaimer: it may be made from an undivided interest or fraction of each interest owned. So let's say there's a stack of stock documents that the decedent left for you. You can cherry pick through the stock which ones you want, take them out, don't touch the rest. Property in a joint tenancy may be disclaimed by a surviving joint tenant. Again, this has been done when it was not between spouses, and my example of what I used earlier in the course of young man and woman who were 18, 19 years old, who bought some property in Hawaii, and at the death of the first one, 50 years later, all the property went to the survivor. Well, surviving spouse in that case, because she had no family and she wanted her brother's family to get it, disclaimed it. And a surviving spouse can create a divided fraction or percentage of interest owned, and this is typically a life estate, and disclaimed the future interest. So if we have an 89-year-old woman in bad health in a hospital, her husband dies, and he leaves her $1 million of stock, she would be smart to disclaim the corpus and just keep the income for life. When she dies, there's nothing in her estate. And we'll get more into that in week 3. But use of the disclaimer with older people, it makes a lot of sense. Sometimes it's done for non-monetary purposes. My one experience with the disclaimer was where a husband and wife received a bequest from a relative. His wife was extremely superstitious, and when she heard what it was, she was having a heart attack because she didn't want it in her house. So her husband disclaimed it. Now, if the husband accepted it and then gave it to his sister or some other person, it would be a gift involved. But by his disclaiming it, and keeping out his health, did two things. First of all, he didn't have to pay any taxes, and second, he had a happy wife. But that was my one experience of disclaimer. Again, they tend to be relatively rare, typically, again, with older people who are in bad health, who are married. And the use of disclaimers is, as a general rule, again, is to minimize taxation within the family unit. So when you have the older person who disclaims that it's because it's for tax purposes, and again, we will be discussing disclaimers as we go through week 3, which is a tax course, and week 4, which is a tax course. And of course, I promised you early in the course in week 1 that when we got to week 5, we'd start talking about ways to reduce the taxation. Actually, we're going to start it at the end of week 4 when we talk about the marital trust. So be set for the next 2 weeks to be concerned about taxes and how taxes affect people. Again, the tax law is always subject to change, so although it's now $5.12 million or thereabouts, because it's the way it's indexed, realize that it's going to be subject to change, and it could go down drastically, and therefore we always have to keep attuned to what is the taxability involved when someone dies or makes a gift. And that's what we'll be covering in the next 2 weeks.